In the last section, we put together our card section component. Its purpose was to wrap a single section of our card, giving it enough margin and spacing to look nice. Now that we've got all the infrastructure we need, we can focus on building up each part of the card inside of album detail. So the header with the album info, the section with the image, and the Buy Now button at the bottom. First, we're going to start off with the header for each card. This right here is a diagram of what that header on each card should look like. Now, I gotta tell you, a lot of the challenge in React Native is figuring out just how to style all of our different components. I found styling for web to be a lot easier, personally, just my own personal thought. Whereas with React Native, you have to spend a little bit more time planning out how you'll construct each component. And so that's exactly what we're gonna do right now. We're gonna plan exactly how we will build this header. So underneath the header is the JSX that we'll probably more or less end up using. This is kind of the bare minimum of what we want. On the left hand side, we're going to have the artist's image, or their little headshot. And we haven't spoken too much about the image tag with React Native, but take my word for it. Basically, there is a tag that we can use to show images, so we'll figure that part out. And then beneath it, we'll have one text tag for the album name, and then another one for the artist name as well. So this means that we have kind of a little bit of a layout issue here. We need to figure out how to tell the image tag to show itself on the left, and then the text tags to show itself to the right, but also those need to line up. So this is our big first layout challenge that we've come into. So we're going to spend a little bit of time to figure out the best way to get this layout right here. To solve our layout issues with React, the best tool that we have, and perhaps the only one I should say, is the Flexbox layout mechanism. We spent a little bit of time previously discussing Flexbox, but it was all in the context of figuring out how to get some content to center or line up a single item in a container. Flexbox is also used to lay out multiple items within a container as well, which is exactly what we need to do here. So we're going to spend a little bit more time figuring out Flexbox and then immediately apply that knowledge to our header. So here's kind of our default header right now. If we just threw in the image tag and then the two text tags, we would end up seeing some content like this. Now the text tags wouldn't have the actual border to them. I just put the border on there to make it clear that, hey, this is one of the text tags. So with React Native, if we absolutely ignore styling and just toss tags into a container, they're all going to be placed on the upper left-hand side of the container and then line up vertically. That's how it works by default. Now we spoke about using Flexbox in the context of working with a single item previously, right? When we were talking about the actual header component, this one up here. But now we need to figure out how Flexbox works with multiple items as well. So all the properties we had previously discussed are still relevant. So we can still use justify content with flexend to move all these items to the bottom, or center to center it, whatever we might want to do. Let's check out how some of these different properties would affect this header. So here's our flexend equivalent. If we said on the view container, on the containing item, if we gave it justify content flexend, everything gets shoved down to the bottom. Likewise, if we gave it center, everything gets centered up. So largely behaves the same way as when we have a single item, but the difference is that if we have multiple items within this container, they all get kind of centered up. Now the next two are where things start to get a little bit more interesting and only relevant when we have multiple items within a container. The first one is justify content space between. So with space between, the container will take its list of internal items and it will maximize and equalize the amount of space between each item. So we've got the first item at the very top of the container and then the last item at the very bottom of the container. And then all the space in between the intermediate items is equalized, so they're completely equal in between there. Lastly, space around. Space around is much like space between, but it also allocates item to the ahead of the very first item and after the very last item as well. So in theory, each of these white spaces in here, 1, 2, 3, and 4, should be completely equal whenever we're using space around. So as we've just seen, there's a lot of different rules available for justify content, and we'll certainly be using them, or a couple of them over time, But for right now, let's focus exactly on how to apply them to styling this header. Let's take a quick break and then come back and figure out how we will use justify content properties to style that header cell. So let's take a quick break and then figure that out. In the last section, we spoke a little bit more about justify content with Flexbox and what it does to some elements within a container. We spoke about flex end, center, space between, and then space around as well. So in this section, we're going to figure out how to actually apply these to our particular case, styling our header. So I'm going to go to the next slide here. So back on track, we're focusing on the header. We have our profile image on the left, which we still have to create these things, so don't worry, we'll get to that. And then we've also got some stacked content on the right-hand side, the 2 lines of text. So the interesting dynamic here is that we want to line up the 2 lines of text so they stack on top of each other, but both lines of text need to be next to the image. So as a solution, I'm going to suggest that we take the following approach. We'll wrap both the image and the text, the 2 text tags, with 2 separate views. So one view to wrap the image, and then one view to wrap the 2 text tags inside of here. Then we can use the justify content of flex start to get both these items to push up to the left-hand side of the container here. Just one quick issue though, Everything we've been discussing about justify content has mentioned that we use it for positioning elements in the vertical or up and down direction. So how are we going to use justify content right here to line up items on the left and right direction like I just suggested? And that's basically my lead in to one of the last confusing Flexbox items we need to discuss, the idea of flex direction. So first, I want to very quickly remind you that back in one of the previous sections inside of our card section, we added on a property flex direction of row right here. So we've kind of already done the wire up for this, and now we're just kind of going back and discussing exactly why we did that. Okay, so flex direction property. So here's what flex direction does. The justify content rule can be used to apply to either vertical or horizontal layout, so either direction. The direction that it will apply to is determined by the flex direction rule. With React Native, the flex direction rule defaults to column. So by default, all of the justify content rules that we place all over the place apply to the vertical positioning of items. If we want it to make it apply to the horizontal layout of items, however, we can change flex direction to row instead. When we change it to row, it then turns flex direction to spacing items in the horizontal direction. So this is exactly how we're going to solve our layout issue. So here's the plan. We're going to create 2 separate views for the header, like we previously discussed just a minute ago. One is going to wrap the image, and the second one is going to wrap the 2 text tags. Then on the card section, which we already created, we will give it the properties flex direction of row and justify content flex start. So flex direction row is going to say, hey, all of the items inside card section should lay themselves out going left to right instead of top to down, or top to bottom, excuse me. And then justify content of flex start will mean push those items all the way up to the start edge of the container, which will be the left-hand side in this case. So again, we have already gone ahead and added these 2 properties to our card section, so that is completely done. Everything should work as we expect because we added these 2 properties. One last thing, we also need to make sure that we know how to lay out our 2 lines of text vertically within the view. So that's one more little challenge we got to do. So we're going to also introduce the idea of a text container. So the text container is going to be just the view tag that we said we would use to wrap the 2 text tags. Then on the text container, we'll say that it should have a flex direction of column, so it should lay out its items top to bottom, and it should have a justify content of space around. And remember what space around does. It says lay out equal spacing between all of the elements within this container. So we have 2 text tags in here. We will take some equal amount of white space and allocate it between the top, the middle, and the bottom of those two text tags. So that's why we're going to use justify content of space around on that view container section. All right, so we've now spent a lot of time talking about Flexbox and how we're going to lay out this header. Again, Flexbox is really the one rule or the one great tool we have for doing layout with React Native. So it's very important that you have at least some reasonable idea of how Flexbox layout works. And that's why I wanted to have a little bit of an expanded lecture on it. So let's take all these rules, all these strategies that we've now looked at, and apply them to our header in the next section. We've now spent a lot of time discussing Flexbox, so it's time to apply this knowledge to our component. Recall that our goal that we established in the last section was to use a new view container, two of them in fact, that one is going to wrap the image to the left-hand side, and then another one is going to wrap the text to the right-hand side as well. So I call this text container. It is a view tag that is going to serve as a text container, just to be clear with the terminology there. That text container should have the rules flex direction column to make everything line up vertically, and also justify content of space around to make sure that we get equal spacing of our white space above the text tags, between them, and below as well. So let's get started with this. I'm in my album detail component right here, and here's the card section with our existing single text tag. So it is to this card section right here that we're going to want to add two new view tags. One for the image and then one for the the text as well. So we'll start off by importing view at the top from React Native, and then we'll also add in our two new view tags in here. So one that will eventually house the image that we still need to add, and then the second to wrap the two lines of text that we still need to place. So we've got the one existing text tag right here for our album title. We'll add in another text tag to show our artist name as well. If you recall the JSON data that we got back from our album, here it is right here, and I know it's kind of small, let me dial it up. There we go. So right now we're making use of the album title property. We also have access to the album artist property as well, and that's how we get the artist name. So inside of our component right here, if we reference props.album.artist, that will give the artist name inside of this text tag. So we'll say props.album.artist. And so now we would expect to have both our title of the album and the artist name in here as well. Okay, so now last step for right now, we're going to add in some styling rules for this single view container right here, and our sole purpose is to make sure that this text lines up vertically, number one, and that it uses that justify content of space around so that we get equal white space above, between, and below the two text tags. So we'll start off by adding in our styles object at the bottom. And then I'm going to use a style name of header content style. If you can think of a better name than this right here, definitely go for it. Remember that all the property names that we use are more or less arbitrary, right? They're just something that have to make sense to ourselves as engineers when we come back and look at this component some number of weeks, months, years in the future. So it's just something that needs to make sense to ourselves. So inside of here, we'll specify our flex direction of column and a justify content of space around. Next, we will apply this style to our view container right here. So we'll say style is styles.header content style, like so. Okay, so let's now refresh our app and see how we're doing. So cool, we definitely have both the album name and the artist name right beneath it. You'll notice that right now, the card that we have is kind of condensing down to just wrap, or let me rephrase that a different way. The card's height is dictated by the amount of text that's sitting inside of it right now. So at this point in time, these Flexbox rules we add, specifically the justify content space around, it appears that it's not really doing anything at this point in time. It's when we start to resize the height of this thing, the height of this section right here, that we're going to see how that justify content of space around works. The height of this section right here is going to start to change as soon as we add in that image tag. So let's continue in the next section and start working on getting that image tag in here so that we have a card section with some measurable, kind of non-minimum height. We're almost complete with our header section to our card. We just have to get our image thumbnail to render for now. So remember, that image thumbnail is going to be just a little portrait of the artist who made this particular album. React Native provides built-in support for rendering images, and it works mostly like how normal image tags with HTML work. The React Native library has an image primitive just like the text and view primitives that we get. So in addition to text and view, we are also going to import an image tag as well. Then to make use of an image, or to actually place it, we'll use it just like normal JSX. So inside of my existing view tag, I'll add a reference to image. And of course, we also have to tell this image tag exactly what image we want it to render. So to tell an image what we want it to render, we need to pass it a source prop, or a prop named source. So we'll say source equals something. To this source reference right here, we have to provide an object with a URI property, and the URI must be a link to an actual image that React Native can reach out and download and show inside the application. So we'll place an object in here with a property of URI, and then right here, this is where we have to specify the actual address of the image that we want to show on the screen. Now, we need to figure out, of course, well, what link is that? How are we going to get that link? If we go back over to our album data, the data that we're actually working with for each individual album, recall that the image that we want to show for just that little thumbnail is available on the property thumbnail image. That means if we have reference in here, props.album.thumbnail_image, it will be the link that we want to show. So we'll reference props.album.thumbnail_image, like so. Cool. One thing I want to point out really quick here before we test this out in the browser, or I keep saying browser, you know what I mean, the simulator. Before we test this out in the simulator, I want you to take reference of the fact, or take notice that at this point in time, we've got 3 references to props.album throughout our code in this component right here. Whenever we start to get more than one reference to a prop out of our props object, or something out of our props object, it's always good convention to destructure that property out of our argument of props. So right now we're only making use of the album prop from the props object. So I'm going to destructure out of here the album object. And then on top of that, you'll notice that I'm referencing the album object 3 times as well. So it might make sense to also destructure out thumbnail image, title, and artist. Now when I'm further destructuring out of an argument object like this, I can do it one of 2 ways. I can either destructure directly from the argument itself and say give me the title and the artist, but that starts to get really long for my argument list up here. And so I'm going to take a different approach. I'm going to destructure inside of the function body. So I'll say that I want my title, my artist, and my thumbnail image from the album object. Now inside of my JSX, I'm going to remove all the references to props.album. So I'll go down to just thumbnail image, just title, and just artist, like so. Okay, so that definitely cleans up our JSX a little bit. It certainly makes our method here a little bit more top heavy, you might say. But I find that this is usually a good approach whenever you start to make multiple references to your props object. Okay, went off the beaten path there just a little bit, but anyways, getting back on point, we've got our image tag in place right now, so we should be able to refresh our simulator and see the image pop up. So I'll refresh, and no success. Well, that's too bad. No image appears to pop up here. So this is a little gotcha with React Native and images. I mentioned earlier that images behave basically the same way as their HTML cousins, but that is really not quite true. When we use an image in React Native, the image will not expand to fill the space available to it by default. Instead, we have to manually add in a rule that tells the styling rule, that tells the image tag exactly how big the image should be. So again, the image technically is rendering here right now, but because we did not specify a height and a width for it, our image just appears to not exist. So to solve this, we must add a style for our image. So we'll flip on down to our styles object towards the bottom, and I'm going to add in another style property here that I'm going to call thumbnail style. And for thumbnail style, I'll give it a set height of 50 and a width of 50 as well. Now we're going to pass this thumbnail style directly to that image tag, and it should appear inside of our simulator as we would expect. Okay, so here's my image tag. I'm going to give this thing a new line just to make it a little bit more legible. So now I've got the opening image, some props, and the closing tag right here as well. Make sure that you did not lose the closing tag. Then we'll pass in a style of styles.thumbnail style. All right, so let's test this in the simulator again. I'll refresh, and now it appears that in fact we do have our image popping up. Perfect, so just what we expected. It does look a little bit creepy right now having 5 images in a row, but we'll fix it up as soon as we start adding in the other content for the each card in here. Trust me, it's going to start to look really nice. You'll also notice that our styling rules, or the justify content rule of space around, started to kick in now that the header has some additional width to it. So we've got some white space before, between, and after each text tag, and it's all evenly distributed at this point. So that's our justify content rule in action. Okay, one last little refactor I want to do in here. Along the same veins as destructuring from our props object to reduce the references to props and album, we're now making 2 references to the styles object in here as well. So this is an optional refactor. It's totally up to you. It's something that I personally like to do, but it's not a necessity. Because we are referencing styles twice here, I might also choose to destructure from the styles object as well. So I can optionally do thumbnail style and header content style. I'm going to destructure those from styles. And then inside of my style object, or my style props, I no longer need to reference the styles object. I can just say directly thumbnail style and also my header content style. So again, an optional refactor. It's something I really like to do, especially once I've got a lot of different styles floating around on the screen. Okay, so we're definitely making progress here. We've got our image popping up, but the styling, it's still a little bit off. So let's finish up on the styling in the next section. We're definitely picking up inertia with our header tag here, so let's keep on rolling along and start fixing up some of the styling. When you look at the header in the style, in the simulator, you'll see that there's a little bit too little space right here. We could definitely use a little bit more space between the image and the text to the right-hand side. In addition, it would be really nice if the first piece of text in here, which was the album title, was just a little bit larger at least, or hopefully a little bit bolder as well, just to make it stand out a little bit. So let's start by fixing some of the spacing with this image here. We'll achieve this by adding some styling to the view tag that is wrapping the image. So on this view tag right here, we'll set up some margin on the left and right hand side. That means we're going to have to add another property to our styles object. So we'll go down to our styles object at the bottom, and I'm going to add on another property that I'm going to call thumbnail container style. So the thought process behind this name right here, it is that the container that is containing the thumbnail. So, thumbnail container style. So for this container right here, I also want to kind of center the thumbnail in there, right? I want to make sure that it's nice and centered. To make sure that it's centered, we'll give it the justify content of center and align items of center as well. And then we'll give it some left and right hand spacing by giving it the margin left of 10 and a margin right of 10 as well. Now we can add this thumbnail container style to that view that we have up top. So I'll scroll back up. I'm going to put in some new lines here now that I've got a pretty good number of things I need to destructure out of my styles object. And then I will pull in my thumbnail container style. Then we're going to take that style and just use it on the view tag. So hey view, here you go, use your style. Thumbnail container style. Cool. Now remember, the other thing that I mentioned is I would really like if our header text, so the text tag that has the artist title or the album title was a little bit larger and maybe bolded as well. Let's start off by just making it larger, and then we'll decide whether or not we want to bold it. So I'm going to scroll back down, and we're going to add another text rule in here. I'm going to put this one right underneath the header content style because this is the one that's holding the text style. I'm going to add a single rule to just add on to that text. So I'm going to call this one, let's do header text style. And I will give it a font size of 18. So now we'll place this text style as well. So we'll scroll back up, destructure it, and then add it to our first text tag. So here's the first text tag. It is the album title, and I'll give it the style of header text style. All right, time for the moment of truth. How are we doing? Let's check it out. Let's refresh the simulator. Okay, now this is starting to look pretty good right here. This is definitely coming along. We've got the nice, slightly larger, not too large, but just slightly larger album title at the top. We've got some spacing to the left and right hand side of the image, and the image is kind of centered vertically and horizontally inside of that view container as well. So this is definitely getting towards where we want to be. So let's now continue and start working on the body of each card. Remember, the body of each card, we want it to have the album artwork. And we've already got access to the album artwork on our album object. So if we go back to our album object, you'll recall that it's available as the image property. So here's image, image, image. Each one has the artwork image. So we want to just add in a new card section, right? Because this is a new section on the card. And inside of that card section, we just want to show this album cover, just the album cover, nothing else. So it shouldn't be too bad. We'll add in first the card section and then an image tag inside of it. So beneath our existing card section, we'll add in another one. And then we can add in an image tag as well. Again, I'll give it the source property. Define URI, and if you recall, that image link, the actual thing we want to use here, is available as props.album.image, but we are doing some destructuring, so I'm going to reference just image, and then I'll scroll back up to my album destructuring right here, and I'm also going to destructure out of my album. I'm going to destructure out the image property as well. So I've got my title, artist, thumbnail image, and image coming directly out of the album. So I'll go back down. Yep, we're all good to go. Let's refresh the simulator. And okay, yep, it looks like we definitely have the additional section on here, but as you might expect, we did not set a height or a width to the image right here. And so, yep, it didn't actually show up inside the simulator. Theoretically it's there, theoretically the image is there, but we did not give it a height or a width, so it gets condensed down to basically 0. This time around, however, when we decide on the dimensions of our image, things start to get a little bit interesting if you think about it. Remember, I said that we have to specify the height and the width of the image. But this time we have an image that we want to stretch all the way from the left-hand side all the way to the right-hand side. And that width right there, that is not something that's very easy for us to hard code, right? It's not easy for us to hard code that value, and here's why. We do know, in theory, maybe we haven't really done this, but in theory we know the width of the device that we're on, right? But then we will also have to add in like the margin over here, the margin over here, and then any internal margin to the card section as well. In other words, it's just really tough to calculate the width of our image. We want it to span the entire width of this card section right here. So to solve this, we're going to use just a little trick with React Native styling of images. Okay, we're going to use a little trick. First, we'll add in a new style to our styles object, and I'm going to call this one just image style. So then here's the trick. I am going to set a fixed height, and I'm going to say that's going to be 300, which is a pretty respectable height. Now here's where it gets interesting. to make sure that the image takes up the full width available to it, all the way from the left-hand side of the card to the right-hand side. I'm going to throw on a property of flex1 and a width specifically of null. So I know, you're thinking to yourself, Steven, null is basically like undefined. Why do we even have to define it? Just trust me here. I'm going to provide a width of null. Now we'll apply this image style to that image tag. So I'll go back up to the last image, and I'm going to give it a style of image style. And then we also need to destructure this out of our style object. So I'll scroll up a little bit more, find my image, or excuse me, my styles object right here, and I'll also destructure out the image style. Okay, so let's give this a shot inside of our simulator now. I'll refresh. All right, hot dog. That is exactly what we wanted. Our image is stretching all the way from the left-hand side to the right-hand side as well. This is perfect. So let's scroll down to see the, wait a minute. I'm clicking and dragging here, which is traditionally how you scroll in the simulator, but it appears that there is no scrolling behavior whatsoever. So that is definitely not expected. We have 5 albums on this list though, so I know there are albums further down the list, but I apparently just cannot scroll to them. So we definitely have a little bit of an issue here. Let's continue in the next section and explore this bug a little bit more. In the last section, we got our album artwork to show up, but now we got another problem. It appears that we can't actually scroll through our list at all here. So in this section, we're going to fix up that bug a little bit. Even though React Native has a lot of similarities with its web-based cousin, like running React in the browser, we've also seen a couple of differences. The way in which React Native decides to handle scrolling definitely fits into that list of differences as well. So by default, when we make a really tall component in React Native, it is not going to scroll. So by default, no scrolling, doesn't behave like the browser. We must always be aware of when we are rendering a component that must require the user to scroll like up and down throughout our application. Fortunately, fixing the scrolling issue is a straightforward fix. So enabling scrolling just takes 2 steps. First, we will identify the JSX tags that we expect to be scrollable. So kind of like the bulk section of content that we want to be scrollable. And then second, we will import a React Native component called ScrollView and wrap our content with that. So let's give this a shot. So step 1, we need to identify the content that we expect to be scrollable. So you might think, well, is it the album detail? Not quite. It is really the album list. The album list is what renders our big ol' list of albums. So it's really this view right here. I expect everything inside of this view to be scrollable. Okay, so that's how we identify this. We say, what do I expect to be scrollable? So now step 2, we need to import a component called ScrollView and then replace our existing view with that ScrollView tag. So up at the top, I will find my React Native view component, and I'm just going to replace this because we're not going to use the view tag anymore. I'll replace it with ScrollView. And then going back down to our render method, I will find my view tag and I'll replace it with the ScrollView. So ScrollView is just how we say, hey, you know what, whatever's in here, I want it to be scrollable. Just make it scrollable. So not the worst thing in the world. Let's test this out in the simulator now. We'll open it back up, refresh, and now I should be able to, click and drag. But wait a minute. I can scroll, but it appears that even though I scroll down, everything appears to just bounce back here. So still a little bit of a kind of weird thing here going on. So here's the next gotcha of React Native. And yes, I know this framework has a lot of gotchas. That's why you're taking the course with me, right? So you can find all the crazy things I've found and I will just explain them to you nice and easy. So here we go. Whenever you have a scroll view, you must add a style property of flex1 to your root view element. So let's do that and I'll talk about exactly what's going on. So I'm going to go back to my index view right here. Here's my index container, my app component. I'm going to find my root view, here it is, and I'm going to add to it a style of flex1. And because I'm just adding this one single style, I'm not going to bother with a separate styles object. I'm just going to pass this in here. So what this Flex 1 property does right here is it says, please expand this component to fill the entire content area of the device. So yes, I know that it looked like that was already the case here, but again, this is just one of those gotcha things. I know that it looks like that scroll view is taking up the entire width or area of the screen, but again, it's one of those gotchas. So let's refresh this again. And now when I scroll, all right, hot dog, I'm scrolling through the entire list. Perfect, just what we wanted. So as you're scrolling through, and I'm sure the video you can probably see it, if it appears that it's laggy at all, I guarantee you that is a property of the simulator. If you ever test this out on your device, everything is going to be just buttery smooth scrolling. It is just because we're on the simulator, and I in particular on not the best laptop in the world. So when you put this on a real device, everything is going to scroll very nicely. Okay, so we now have just one feature left in this application. We need to add a button to the bottom of each card here that our users can click to buy an album. So let's start off with that feature in the next section.